Most people think they're eating healthy. I used to think that too. Protein here, greens there, a splash of milk or yogurt to feel responsible. That's the script we were all handed. But once you spend enough years actually testing foods instead of just reading labels, you start noticing something uncomfortable. The foods everyone tells you are essential are often expensive, fragile, overprocessed, or nutritionally redundant. Meanwhile, some of the most powerful nutritional tools on the planet are sitting quietly in the background, ignored, misunderstood, or dismissed as poor people food. That's where this story really starts. Because the plant we're talking about today isn't exotic, it isn't rare, and it definitely isn't new. It doesn't need refrigerated trucks, celebrity endorsements, or a billion-dollar industry propping it up. In fact, that's part of the problem. When something works too well without fitting into modern food systems, it tends to get sidelined. And moringa has been sidelined for a very long time. Here's the bold claim, and I am comfortable standing behind it after years of comparison and real-world use. Pound for pound, versatility for versatility, moringa can replace the role people rely on beef for, the role they rely on spinach for, and the role they rely on milk for, all without asking you to overhaul your life or drain your wallet. Not because it's magic, but because we've been trained to think about nutrition in isolated silos instead of systems. Beef is supposed to make you strong. Spinach is supposed to keep you healthy. Milk is supposed to build bones. That's the narrative. But narratives aren't nutrition, outcomes are. And when you actually step back and look at what people need day to day, sustainable protein support, mineral density, micronutrient coverage, and long-term consistency, the picture changes fast. I've tested moringa in ways most people never do. Fresh leaves, dried powder, cooked, uncooked, mixed into meals, taken alone, used short-term, used daily for months. I've compared it against clean diets, high-protein diets, plant-based diets, and everything in between. I've seen what sticks and what fades once the hype wears off. And what makes moringa different, isn't one flashy benefit. It's the absence of weaknesses that plague other so-called superfoods. Let's talk about why people keep missing it. First, moringa doesn't fit the Western food identity. It's a leaf, but it's not a salad leaf. It's a protein source, but it's not meat. It supports bones, but it's not dairy. That alone makes it uncomfortable. Modern nutrition marketing loves clean categories. Grocery stores love aisles. Supplements love single claims. Moringa refuses to behave that way, so it gets pushed into the miscellaneous health powder corner where serious eaters never look. Second, it doesn't make anyone rich fast. You can grow it easily. You can dry it cheaply. You don't need patented processing to unlock its value. That's a death sentence in a food system built on margins, not outcomes. Beef requires land, feed, logistics, branding. Milk requires infrastructure, cold chains, constant consumption. Spinach requires scale, refrigeration, and fast turnover. Moringa just grows. Reliably, aggressively, almost annoyingly so. That's not a feature you can monetize easily. Now, let me be very clear before we go further. This is not a replace-all food with one plant fantasy. Anyone selling that is lying or inexperienced. What moringa does is something far more useful. It fills nutritional gaps efficiently. It reduces dependency on expensive, fragile foods. It acts like nutritional insurance, especially for people who don't have the luxury of perfect diets every day. When people compare it to beef, spinach, and milk combined, they're not saying it is those foods. They're saying it covers the functions people rely on those foods for: strength support, micronutrient density, and mineral intake in a single resilient source. That distinction matters, and most discussions get it wrong. Let's start with strength, because this is where skepticism kicks in. Protein conversations are dominated by gym culture and marketing slogans. Complete protein, muscle building, high bioavailability. I've heard them all. But here is the quiet truth. Most people don't fail nutritionally because they lack protein. They fail because their protein intake is inconsistent, expensive, or paired with poor micronutrient support. Beef is powerful, no doubt. But it's also costly, resource-heavy, and often consumed irregularly. Moringa doesn't compete with beef on brute force protein density per bite. That's not the game. What it does instead is provide daily, accessible protein support alongside amino acids that don't arrive alone. They come bundled with minerals, antioxidants, and plant compounds that actually help the body use that protein. Over time, that consistency matters more than peak numbers. I've seen people chase protein targets with expensive cuts of meat while ignoring mineral deficiencies that quietly sabotage recovery and energy. Then I've seen those same people stabilize once moringa enters their routine, not because it is dramatic, but because it smooths out the nutritional rough edges. Strength isn't built in isolation, it's built in systems. Now let's talk about greens, because spinach has an almost mythical reputation. Spinach is fine, it's not evil. But it's fragile, seasonal, and nutritionally narrow compared to what people assume. You miss a few grocery runs, and it's gone. It wilts. It spoils. And unless you're eating it constantly, it doesn't deliver the consistency people think it does. Moringa, on the other hand, doesn't care about your schedule. Once dried properly, it lasts. Once grown, it keeps producing. Once integrated, it becomes boring. And boring is exactly what you want from a nutritional staple. Boring means reliable. Where spinach offers a narrow slice of micronutrients, moringa offers breadth. Not in a look at this chart way, but in lived experience. Better baseline energy. Fewer dietary gaps. Less reliance on stacking supplements to patch holes. That is not hype. That is pattern recognition after watching dozens of people cycle through food trends. Milk is the most emotionally protected of the three, so let's tread carefully but honestly. Milk isn't about calcium alone. It's about tradition, culture, and habit. People drink it because they were told to, not because they evaluated it. And while dairy can absolutely play a role in diets, it's also one of the most inconsistent performers across populations. Tolerance varies wildly. Dependency is encouraged. And once you remove it, many people realize they were leaning on it out of habit, not necessity. Moringa doesn't replace milk as a beverage. It replaces milk as a mineral crutch. It provides a plant-based mineral backbone that doesn't demand daily refrigeration, doesn't upset digestion for large portions of the population, and doesn't require cultural loyalty to justify its use. You use it because it works, not because you were told to. This is where the myth-busting gets uncomfortable. If moringa were discovered today by a startup, it would be everywhere. Influencers would swear by it. Athletes would pretend they just found it. Venture capital would flood in. But because it's ancient, accessible, and unbranded, it's treated like background noise. We mistake familiarity for weakness and novelty for power, and that mistake costs people money and health every year. Here's something I want you to think about, and I'm serious about this. Ask yourself how many foods you eat not because you tested them, but because you inherited the belief that they're necessary. Beef, spinach, milk, none of them are bad. But none of them are untouchable either. Moringa exposes that truth simply by existing. Quick pause, and this is where I want to hear from you. Have you ever stuck with a food for years just because everyone says it's good, only to realize later it wasn't doing much for you at all? Drop that in the comments. Those stories matter more than any chart. In the next part, I'm going to break down how to actually use moringa without falling into the common traps, dosing mistakes, preparation errors, and the hype-driven ways people ruin its benefits. I'll also explain why most people who tried it and felt nothing were set up to fail from the start. And if you want to explore sources, prep methods, or deeper reading, I'll link everything useful in the description. Purely educational, no fluff, no miracle promises. Remember this as we move forward. Nutrition isn't about chasing the strongest claim. It's about removing weak links. Moringa doesn't scream for attention. It quietly replaces 3 jobs at once. One of the fastest ways a genuinely powerful food gets dismissed is when people use it wrong, expect fireworks, then walk away disappointed. I've watched that cycle happen with moringa more times than I can count. Someone buys a bag of powder, sprinkles half a teaspoon into a smoothie for 3 days, feels nothing dramatic, and concludes it's overhyped. That reaction says more about how we've been trained to expect nutrition to behave than it does about the plant itself. Here is the uncomfortable truth most channels want to tell you. Moringa is not an acute effect food. It doesn't spike energy like caffeine. It doesn't create a pump like pre-workout. It doesn't slap you in the face with instant feedback. What it does is far more boring and far more valuable. It raises your baseline. And baseline improvements are invisible if you're addicted to spikes. This is where experience matters. When you've been in the trenches long enough, you stop chasing feeling something and start watching patterns. Sleep quality stabilizing, recovery smoothing out. Fewer cravings. More consistent energy across the day instead of peaks and crashes. Those changes don't announce themselves. You notice them when they're gone. Most people fail with moringa for three main reasons. The first is underdosing out of fear. There's a strange psychology around plant powders. People treat them like supplements instead of food. Tiny scoops, infrequent use. Just to be safe. But moringa, when used traditionally and intelligently, is a food first. It was never meant to be consumed like pixie dust. If you're using it once every few days, you're not testing it, you're flirting with it. The second failure point is poor preparation. Tossing raw powder into cold liquid and chugging it is the nutritional equivalent of throwing seeds onto concrete and wondering why nothing grows. Moringa responds to context. Pairing it with warm foods, fats, or simple cooking changes how the body engages with it. Cultures that have used it for generations didn't do so accidentally. They figured out what worked long before influencers existed. The third mistake is expectation mismatch. People want moringa to behave like beef, spinach, or milk individually. But that's the wrong lens. It doesn't replace a steak in one sitting. It replaces the dependency on constantly rotating expensive foods just to feel nutritionally covered. That difference only shows up over time. Let me give you a grounded example. I've seen people obsess over protein intake, meticulously planning meals around meat, shakes, bars, and powders. Miss a day and they panic. Contrast that with someone who integrates moringa daily, not as a replacement for all food, but as a foundation. Over weeks, the second person becomes less fragile. They can miss a perfect meal without feeling off. Their nutrition stops being a house of cards. That resilience is the real value. Now let's address one of the biggest myths directly. Because it keeps popping up in comments everywhere. If it's so powerful, why isn't everyone using it? That question assumes popularity is a proxy for effectiveness. It isn't. Popularity is a proxy for profit alignment. Beef has industries behind it. Milk has industries behind it. Spinach has industries behind it. Moringa mostly has farmers, NGOs, and people quietly using it without needing validation. Those groups don't dominate algorithms. Another myth. If it worked that well, doctors would push it. Doctors are trained to treat conditions, not optimize food systems. They operate within guidelines shaped by institutions that move slowly and conservatively. That's not a conspiracy, it's inertia. Foods like moringa live in the cracks between clinical medicine and everyday nutrition, which is why they're easy to overlook and hard to monetize. Here's where aggressive myth-busting matters. The absence of hype is not evidence of absence. In fact, in nutrition, it's often the opposite. Now let's talk practicality, because theory without application is useless. One of the smartest ways to use moringa is not as a star, but as a background player. You don't build meals around it, you fold it in. Soups, stews, rice dishes, eggs, flatbreads, simple sauces. When you do this, something interesting happens. You stop thinking about it. And when you stop thinking about a food, that means it's sustainable. Contrast that with trendy superfoods that demand ritual, blenders, timing, and social media-worthy presentation. Those foods die the moment motivation dips. Moringa survives boredom. That's a feature, not a flaw. Another insight most people miss. Fresh leaves and dried powder behave differently. Fresh leaves are vibrant, mild, and integrate easily into cooked meals. Powder is concentrated, more intense, and better treated like a seasoning than a drink mix. People who hate it usually abuse the powder in the wrong context, then blame the plant. Let's pause again, because this is where community insight helps. Have you ever written off a food because you tried it once, the wrong way at the wrong time? Be honest about it in the comments. Someone else reading that will avoid the same mistake. There's also a cultural blind spot worth calling out. In many parts of the world, moringa is associated with necessity rather than optimization. That stigma follows it into modern conversations. People subconsciously assume that if something helped communities survive, it can't possibly help people thrive. That's backwards logic. Survival foods are often foundational foods, the ones that keep systems running when resources are tight. Thriving is built on foundations, not luxuries. And this brings us to the quiet reason moringa scares conventional narratives. It democratizes nutrition. It reduces reliance on expensive supply chains. It blurs the line between protein food, green vegetable, and mineral source. When one plant can cover multiple roles competently, it forces uncomfortable questions about how much of our food culture is necessity versus habit. This isn't about rejecting beef, spinach, or milk. It's about reclaiming choice. When moringa is in your toolkit, those foods become options, not not obligations. If you want to explore preparation styles, sourcing considerations, or deeper background reading, I've placed educational resources in the description. No hype funnels, just material worth your time. If you want to understand why certain foods dominate culture while others stay invisible, stop looking at nutrition and start looking at economics. Not in a cynical way, just realistically. After years of watching trends rise and collapse, one pattern is impossible to ignore. Foods don't become essential because they're optimal. They become essential because they're profitable, scalable, and easy to package into a story people will repeat without questioning. Moringa breaks that model. It grows too easily. It lasts too long. It fills too many roles. And because of that, it never slots neatly into a single industry category. That alone makes it disruptive in a way most people don't consciously notice. Think about beef for a moment. Beef isn't just food. It's land management, feed production, transportation, processing plants, branding, and cultural identity. Entire economies are built around it. Milk is similar. Spinach, while simpler, still depends on fast turnover and cold chains. All of these systems require constant consumption to stay profitable. Miss a week, and someone loses money. Moringa doesn't demand urgency. You can grow it, harvest it, dry it, store it, and use it slowly. That patience is a nightmare for hype-driven systems. There's no countdown clock forcing repeat purchases. No panic if you miss a day. Nutritionally, that's a gift. Economically, it's inconvenient. This is where long-term users start noticing something subtle. Once moringa becomes part of your routine, your grocery list changes. You're less reactive. You don't feel the same pressure to catch up nutritionally after a busy week. Your diet becomes more forgiving. That flexibility has value that doesn't show up on labels. I've watched people cut food costs without sacrificing nutrition simply by shifting foundations. Not by eliminating meat or dairy entirely, but by reducing dependency. Beef becomes occasional instead of mandatory. Greens become varied instead of obsessive. Milk becomes optional instead of default. That's not deprivation, that's leverage. Here's another myth worth dismantling. If it's cheap or accessible, it must be lower quality. That belief is marketing residue. Quality in nutrition comes from density, reliability, and absorption, not price tags. Moringa is dense because it evolved to be resilient. Plants that survive harsh environments tend to pack more internal resources. That's biology, not branding. And yet, because it's not expensive, people undervalue it. We're trained to associate cost with effectiveness. That bias causes people to chase premium powders shipped halfway across the world while ignoring a plant that could be grown locally and deliver more consistent results. Let's talk sustainability, not as a buzzword, but as a practical concern. A food that requires constant refrigeration, rapid transport, and precise handling is fragile. When supply chains hiccup, those foods disappear or spike in price. Moringa doesn't flinch. That resilience matters more than ever, especially for people who want nutritional stability regardless of external conditions. This is why you see moringa quietly supported by agricultural experts and community health programs rather than flashy campaigns. It works where conditions are imperfect. And if a food works under stress, it tends to work even better under normal conditions. Now here's something most discussions skip: the psychological relief of nutritional redundancy. When one food can cover multiple roles, your mental load drops. You stop micromanaging every meal. You stop stacking supplements to patch perceived gaps. You gain confidence that your baseline is covered. That confidence changes behavior. People snack less impulsively. They chase novelty less aggressively. They stop swinging between extremes. I've seen this repeatedly. Diets fail not because people lack discipline, but because they're cognitively exhausting. Moringa simplifies without dumbing things down. It gives you breathing room. Quick check-in: have you ever felt overwhelmed trying to optimize every meal? If so, you already understand why foundational foods matter more than flashy ones. Share that experience. Someone else needs to hear it. Another uncomfortable truth: many modern superfoods rely on novelty to stay relevant. Once the story fades, so does usage. Moringa doesn't need novelty, it needs consistency. That's why it survives outside of trends. Let's also address the misconception that moringa is only for certain populations or regions. That idea persists because people mistake origin for limitation. Just because a food has deep roots in one part of the world doesn't mean its value stops there. Nutrition doesn't recognize borders. Biology is biology. If anything, global diets benefit from cross-pollination. Ignoring effective foods because they're not traditional here is how nutritional blind spots form. Moringa exposes those blind spots quietly, without demanding cultural conversion. As always, for those who want to dig deeper into sourcing ethics, preparation methods, or historical use, I've included solid educational links in the description. This isn't about selling a product, it's about understanding a tool. At some point, every serious discussion about moringa hits the same wall. If it's truly this versatile, this resilient, this useful, why isn't it everywhere? Why isn't it pushed as aggressively as protein powders, green juices, or fortified milk alternatives? The easy answer is to point fingers at corporations or institutions, but the real explanation is more uncomfortable and far more human. Mainstream diets don't change because something is better. They change because something is easier to sell. Moringa doesn't have a clean, emotionally resonant story. Beef is strength. Milk is growth. Spinach is virtue. Each one has decades of reinforcement baked into culture, advertising, and childhood memory. Moringa has none of that in the modern West. It doesn't show up in lunchrooms, cartoons, or holiday meals. Without emotional scaffolding, foods struggle to spread no matter how effective they are. There's also the issue of delayed gratification. Foods that go mainstream often promise fast, visible results. Bigger muscles, weight loss, clear skin. Energy spikes. Moringa promises something far less sexy, long-term nutritional stability. That's a hard sell in a culture addicted to immediacy. I've watched people abandon things that were working simply because they didn't feel dramatic enough. Meanwhile, they chase the next big thing, convinced that intensity equals effectiveness. It doesn't. Consistency does. Another factor most people underestimate is ambiguity. Moringa doesn't fit into a single dietary tribe. It's not carnivore. It's not vegan exclusive. It's not keto branded. It doesn't wave a flag. And in modern nutrition culture, that neutrality is a liability. Tribal alignment drives engagement. Systems thinking does not. This is where moringa quietly shines for people who've grown tired of the noise. It doesn't ask you to convert. It asks you to integrate. There's also a deeper psychological barrier at play. People resist foods that threaten the perceived necessity of their habits. If one plant can reduce reliance on multiple staples, it forces uncomfortable reflection. Not everyone wants to confront the idea that they've been overpaying or overcomplicating something as fundamental as food, so instead the food gets minimized. It's fine, it's just another green. It's for other cultures. Dismissal is easier than reevaluation. Here is the paradox. The very reasons moringa hasn't gone mainstream are the reasons it works so well for individuals. It hasn't been distorted by marketing. It hasn't been stripped of context. It hasn't been engineered to appeal, it's been allowed to function. When foods go mainstream, they often lose what made them effective. Processing increases. Additives creep in. Consumption patterns change. Expectations inflate. Moringa has largely avoided that fate. I've seen this cycle repeat with countless superfoods. The moment they become popular, they become diluted literally and figuratively. The early adopters move on, not because the food stopped working, but because the system around it broke. Another truth worth stating plainly, not everyone needs to eat moringa, and that's okay. Nutritional tools aren't universal solutions. But for people who want resilience, affordability, and flexibility, it's one of the few options that consistently delivers without demanding loyalty. Let me ask you something and think before you answer. Are you more interested in foods that impress others, or foods that quietly make your life easier? That distinction shapes every nutritional choice you make, whether you realize it or not. As always, I've placed educational materials and background resources in the description for those who want to explore further. No pressure, no promises, just information worth having. If anyone tells you moringa is perfect, stop listening. No food is. And one of the fastest ways a genuinely useful tool gets lumped in with hype is when its limitations are ignored or explained away. Real credibility comes from knowing exactly where something shines and where it doesn't. So let's be clear, grounded, and honest. First limitation, moringa is not a calorie-dense food. This matters more than people think. You cannot fuel a hard physical lifestyle on it alone. If you're doing heavy labor, intense training, or recovering from major physical stress, you still need sufficient calories from starches, fats, and other protein sources. Moringa supports systems, it doesn't replace fuel. This is where inexperienced advocates get people into trouble. They talk about nutrient density without acknowledging energy demands. That's how foods get blamed for failures they were never designed to solve. Second limitation, it does not replace animal foods 101. Yes, it can reduce reliance. Yes, it can fill gaps. No, it does not replicate the sensory satisfaction, caloric impact, or cultural role of meat and dairy. Anyone claiming otherwise is selling ideology, not nutrition. What moringa does is reduce fragility. It makes diets more forgiving. That's different from replacement. Third limitation, quality varies massively. This is a big one, and most people only learn it the hard way. Poorly dried leaves, old powder, contaminated processing, or careless storage can destroy flavor, effectiveness, and trust. When someone says they tried moringa and felt nothing or felt off quality, is often the culprit. This is why blindly buying the cheapest option without understanding sourcing is a gamble. Not because expensive equals better, but because careless handling ruins plant foods faster than people realize. Fourth limitation, some people need time to adapt. Even gentle food-based changes can create digestive shifts. That's not danger, it's adjustment. But it means jumping in aggressively without easing in can backfire. The irony is that people who rush hardest are often the first to quit. This isn't unique to moringa, it's a pattern across nutrition. Slow integration beats enthusiasm every time. Here is the key insight most hype-driven conversations miss. Limitations don't weaken a food's value, they define its role. When you know what something is not meant to do, you stop misusing it. This is also why moringa works best in people who already think in systems. People who chase silver bullets tend to bounce off it. People who want stability tend to keep it. Let's flip the lens for a moment. If someone's diet already includes diverse whole foods, sufficient calories, and cultural enjoyment, moringa acts like reinforcement. If someone's diet is chaotic, inconsistent, or budget-constrained, moringa acts like damage control. Both roles are valid, but they're different. Another myth worth dismantling. If I don't feel it, it's not working. That mindset belongs to stimulants, not nourishment. The best foods don't announce themselves. They make bad days less bad. They make recovery quieter. They reduce noise. And silence is hard to market. Here is a subtle observation from years of watching patterns. People who stick with moringa tend to stop talking about it. That's usually the sign something has integrated properly. When a food becomes normal, it no longer needs defense. Quick engagement moment. Have you ever overhyped something in your own mind, only to abandon it once reality set in? That cycle is more common than failure. Share it. Someone else will recognize themselves in it. For those who want guidance on quality indicators, preparation styles, and realistic integration timelines, I've linked educational material in the description. Not recommendations context.